creating when we want to store a name to a variable, the variable is declared as an array of characters because there is no string data type. Okay, so that is how we store string value using array of characters. But since in C Sharp, it also now supports string data type, which is basically an array of characters, pwede na nato gamiton analogy when breaking up this type of input. Okay, so let's modify. Let's say enter two values. So ano lang. So is it safe for me to say there's no need to discuss about using split? So okay ra di na ko mo discuss og split kay nakabaw naman mo gamit ato. Okay, so I think majority i-discuss pa jud di kay majority nakagamit na magud ato. So let's say for instance, if you're gonna be using the shortcut method, okay, so enter two values. So take note, okay, ang katong split na command is applicable to string data type. Okay, so take note when you use readline, okay, ang i-return ni readline is a string, di ba? Okay, but that is only equivalent to one string. So mo ni ang inyong gibuhat is something like this. We call the split method. Okay, so unsa man ang split method? So as stated here in our documentation, a split method splits a string into substrings that are based on the characters in the array. So kani nga characters in your array. Okay, so it basically returns an array whose elements contains the substring from the instance that are delimited by one or more characters in the separator. So if you use split di, okay, most of you are using ingani raman to, no? Walay sulod. Okay, so essentially it makes use of the space as a delimiter by default. Okay, so that's why when I try to make use of this one, let's say ato ang i-print, how do we, okay, so for each x in inputs, now na to, for each in, okay, so inputs, ano ni highlight ko? For no, wag kang si h. Okay, sorry. So when we use the split function, it automatically breaks this string of yours into smaller units, okay, based on the delimiter na imong i-supply dire. Okay, now since most of you is murag gagamit man ani without any delimiter, so I do believe you have unsa na siya discovered by accident nga panday ni siya automatic mo breakdown sa imong string into an array based on the so-called delimiter. So when you say delimiter, think of it as a character nga gigamit nimo as a tandanan kung asa kadapit ka mag-split. Okay? So let's say padagano nato, oops, kadit lang. Nalimot ko anong gabutang ko for each that is supposed to be for display. Okay, so right line. So plus, sa gamito nato diri si x. So we'll also put siguro ano lang, dash to indicate that it is a new entry from the input. Okay. So when you run your code, okay, so asan ito? Uh, input. Uy, stop man siya. Okay, so enter tag two values. So ABC, QRT, something like this. Then, bubutang na punta. Okay, that. Okay. So, if I run this code, okay, pila may pila ka lines ang iyang i-display. Pila ka elements ang array nga iyang i-create. Okay, there will be 4. Okay. So, asa man ato nga 4, so makita nato dire, mao ni siya ang first input, then by default space pa niyang delimiter mao nang ang kani may gihimo niyang sunod nga element sa imong array, then mao ni ikatulo, then mao ni ika-upat nga element sa imong array. Okay? So it seems like nabutangan din akong space dire. Mo nang naa siya ika-upat nga gibutang. Okay? So anyway, that is how you use split. Now what if ganahan ka nga pati ka ng comma gamito nimo as a delimiter for split? Okay? So you specify here, di ba? As stated, mag-create ka og unsa to? An array of characters. Okay? So you can make use of something like this. Okay? So initialize nimo, let's say what character will I use? So aside sa space, I will also use the character comma, and I will also use the character dot. Okay? So this will extend, okay, the number of delimiters that can be used to specify, okay, your quad, to specify your delimiter when breaking down your string. Okay? So for example, again, ASD space def dot cdb dot xc. Okay? So basically, mo na gamit sa ibang split na command. Okay? So aside from the space nga default niya nga delimiter, you were able to also make use of dot and comma as a delimiter to break down your entry. Okay? So mo ni ang shortcut, okay, sa pagbasa og multiple inputs from a single line. So dire, I'm just using for each because based sa kung input man god, wa mo kay specific size as to how many values ang basahon. Okay? So that's why gamit kaayo si for each for that purpose. But actually, pwede raman sad na gamiton nimong for loop. Okay? So if you remember dira sa inyong notes sa basic, okay, we actually have so-called property sa array nga pwede nimong magamit, especially if you want to identify kung pila ka book elements in the array. If in case you are not sure as to how many elements there are because it was not declared during compile time. Okay? So as you can see, inputs bitaw no pila may size akong input ng array. Wa ko mag-specify daan. But basically, kung pila ka book elements i-generate ani nga function split, mao ni mo dictate as to pilay size sa atuang array mag-create. Okay? So how will I know kung pilay ako ang gamiton nga limit diri sa ako ang for loop? Okay? So unsa to nga property ang pwedeng magamit? Okay? Anyone? Nakahinumdum na siya sa notes. Okay. Inputs.length. Okay. So take note, ang length nimo is in capital. Okay? So makita po ninyo diri guys, if we use this IDE, it is easy for us to identify kaning gitawag nato nga properties and methods. Okay? So again, based on our or the YouTube video that you have watched, properties are synonymous with attributes. Okay? Methods are synonymous with functions or behavior sa usa ka object. Okay? So, kana lang, gamit ka na length para makakibaw ka as to kapila ka mag-iterate sa imong loop. So, of course, I++. Okay? So, that's an alternative for using the for each statement. Okay? So, ang advantage lang of using for loop manggod compared sa for each is that you are able to modify the entry of your array. Whereas, when you talk about sa for each loop, you are not able to modify the content of the array. Your so-called access towards the array when you are using for loop is only read-only. Okay? So, makabasa ra ka sa array but you can never modify the contents of the array. So, mao na usa sa disadvantage using the for each. What's so good about the for each is that unsa man. Okay? You don't need to specify the length. Okay? Because internally, iyahan na nang gi-perform based on the array or kanang in general based on the collections nga imuhang gihatag. Okay? So again, just running this sample code. Okay? So again, kuan naman day si X diri. Ato ang gamiton si inputs. Okay? So of course, we use the index I. Okay? And compile. Okay? So, ano na siya? ASD, comma, URD, PFG. Okay, so very useful, especially when maabot ta o kanang gitawag nato nga file handling. Okay, so I do believe in C you were able to perform this on some of your projects for those who are using file handling nga nag-database. Okay, so are you familiar with the CSV format, guys? Okay, unsa ng CSV gani? What does CSV stands for?
Comma separated value, sir.
Comma separated values. Okay? So, if you try to open a CSV file in Excel, makabantay mo nga kanang imuhang entry, okay, nga separated by comma are translated into different columns. Okay? So, gingana na niya pag-interpret when you are storing data using comma separated values. Okay? So if you want to create a data with rows and columns, you can simply do this when you are saving your file. Okay? So you separate it with a comma, and that means in Excel, it will be separated in columns. Okay? So if you have an array of strings like this, then that will define the number of rows on your data. Okay? So, ingana lang guys. So, okay. So, I think nanatay kwan understanding about how split function works. Okay. So, obviously, what do we do if mubasa ta og integer. Okay? So kung mubasa tag integer, bitaw na unsaon na nato kung mubasa tag integer. So ibalik lang nato dire. Okay? So I will just delete that. Actually pwede ka specify dire kung dili ka ganahan og um di ka ganahan og space, di ba? Pwede man na nimo specify. Okay? As something like this. Para you can only break down your entry kung naay kama. Or kung ganahan ka nga makita jud nimo nga the delimiter is a space, then you can actually also put there an empty character. Okay? Now, sa ganito, how do we convert this into an integer? Okay? So, since na naman kay array, probably ang buhaton sa uban is something like this. Okay? Convert that to int. Di ba? Para ang kanang string ma-convert into a number nga pwede nimo ma-manipulate. Di ba? Something like this. Pwede na ito buhaton. Or, pwede po na to guys. Okay? Nga, kabaw naman ta nga this will be returning to us. Okay? This string input. Okay? Pwede rato nimo tagsa-tagsaon, then pass it inside your for loop. Okay? So, gamit lang ka og convert nga function. Okay? So, anyway, kana na siguro sa split. Okay? So, let's proceed to the kaning lingaw nga part. Okay? Now, what if we are not allowed to use the split function? Okay? Kay ganahan jud sa sir mahibaw sa imong alibibad, abilibad, unsa ba? Abilidad di ay. Oh. Okay? Kay kana may nindot good nga ato ang i-practice ba nga if you are given limited tools, make the most of it. Okay? So di ta mangita og tools nga wala dira sa ato ang atubangan. Kay tuhon kung manrabaho mo in a company na am gitawag na to nga limited lang ang resources. So we make use of what we have. Okay? So mo na makapakuan guys, mo na makapa tawagan ay, mo na makapabilib sa imong boss nimo. Okay? Mo na usa sa mga trademark sa mga Pinoy that given this limited amount of tools, Pinoy can always make something out of it. Okay? So, let's now proceed to that solution. Okay? So, apparently, gahatag kog exam nga wala ko motudlo og split. That's why a lot of you were having a hard time solving those problem that involves multiple inputs. Unsaon man namo pagbasa, uy. Okay? Maunay dakong pangutana nagtangag og dakong ganti. Okay? Pero ang question is, unsaon bitaw na siya, no? How do we answer that problem? Okay? So, basically, we must have a way to read the input first. Okay? Having read the input, what do we do next? Okay? Unsa kay sunod natong pwede buhaton? Okay? So, let's say na anak ko yung ani. Okay? So, kaniya to guys, we're just training mga problem solving skills ba? Okay? That is very important when you do your program. It's not all the time that you have access to the internet nga naamoy word problem, dagan data sa internet to look for the ready-made answer. Okay? So, if ing ana man gani ang style nato as programmer, then we are doomed to be replaced by AI. Okay? Kay mas paspas mangita si AI sa internet o mga humandaan nga answer. Okay? So what gives us edge over AI is our ability to solve problems. Okay? So given that naatay ang ani nga input, okay? Naatay ang ani nga input o na not responding na. Okay. So let's say unsa to? 1 2 3 4 5 6, okay? So expected man na ay duha ka input sa ato ang string. Okay? So we know that this is actually similar to an interpretation ng array of characters. Okay? So in ani ra na ang atoang string. Okay? Okay? So yung ana ra na si string. It's actually just an array of characters. Okay? So kung natay input something like this, of course, pwede pa jud na siya mag-usab-usab kay pwede man, di ba? Dili lang tulo ka digits, pwede duha ka digits, pwede upat ka digits. Okay? Now, if we treat your string as like an array of characters, unsa na to pagkabaw nga kaning si 1, 2, 3 will be referring to the first input. Okay? So let's try to concept. Let's try to flex your understanding. Okay? So this is index 3, index 4, index 5, and index 6. Okay? Sige, kung kamo guys, okay? What will we do? Okay? So if this is your string, which is basically an array of characters, okay? How will we break this down into two inputs? So likely, knowing that each of this input is a character, di ba? That means pwede din nato ni siya ma-visit ang element inside our string tagsa-tagsa. Okay? Do you agree? Okay. Do we agree with that? We can treat this string as an array of character. Okay. What do you think? I have here a for loop. So let's try. Okay. So if I can print each of these elements, okay, so I'll still make use of the right line method. So i-print na ko siya one character at a time. Okay. So I'll put this again. Then I'll call in the inputs because string is basically just like that of an array of characters. So that means pwede din ako na siya i-display one character at a time. Okay? So something like this. Okay? So let's try. If we are able to print this input one line at a time. So if you can print this input one line at a time, so therefore, pwede din siya nga line of code nga pwede nimo ma-access one line at a time. Okay? So again, let's try that out. 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7. Para naalay variation sa atong input na may 3 digits, na 4 digits. So as we press enter, okay, we were able to read one character at a time. Okay? So nakita na ninyo? Okay. Now, sunod na tong buhaton is since pwede man din nato siya mabasa one character at a time, you can create an algorithm that you visit each of these element na as long as that is a character, what will we do? Okay? What will we do? So, what we can do is pwede ing ani. Okay? As we visit our input, as we read through the elements, okay, pwede na to basahon tagsa-tagsa, and as we read it tagsa-tagsa, we put it in a container to create a new string. Okay, so something like this. Okay, now how about sa sunod? Space naman. So kanang space, it will be like our delimiter. Okay, mao na ato ang gamiton tandanan nga, uy, naay space. Pasabot ani niya, the next character nga ako ang basahon, dapat ako anang isud og lain nga storage. Okay? Something like this. Okay? So, what I'm doing is I'm working just like the split function. Okay? Gigamit na ko ang space as my reference to identify the next input. Okay? So, if I make the code for that, how will I do it? Okay? How will I do it? So, let's say for example, kung gamit lang ko write, okay? So, when you say write, that means it will be written in a single line. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So, yung aning siya. 1, 2, 3, then space, 4, 5, 6. Okay? So, assuming that ganahan ko ing ani po ang output nga considered siya as another input, ibutang sa next line, how would I do it? Okay. So, basically, di ba, before you print, pwede ka maghimo og condition nga if, di ba, console input is equal to, okay, is equal to unsa man. So, character man na siya is equal to a space. What will we do? So, probably issue a command called continue. Okay? Or pwede po, before you continue, pwede ta mag tawag o console write line. Okay? Just to add that extra line para ang sunod nga input nato is what na pod niya sa ubos. Okay. So let's try that out. Oops. Sabi siya. I cannot be assigned. It is read only. Cannot implicitly convert type char to bool. Ay, sorry. Okay. Nakuwangan di ay. Okay. So, again, reading the inputs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. As we press enter, there you go. Okay? So, nabasa nato siya ang input and we were able to break it down into two strings. Okay? So, ang pangutana na po ani niya ron, kana, pang display man na siya. But what we did is something that would read them as a string. Okay? So, again, if we run this code, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, makita na to dire, duol-duol na tinuod. But again, this is a display. Okay? What we actually need is dapat ma-convert ni siya into a string. Okay? So we know that we need two strings, di ba? So na naman tayo, how will I call this? Okay? Let's say operator, kunuhay, kay man to yato ang required sa atong input. They act as operators man. Di ba? Ang first entry o second entry. So let's create an array. Okay? So let's call it as oper, short for operator. So kabaw naman ta pila ka buok input ang expected. How many inputs are expected? Duha. Okay? So you just create and allocate two elements for your string oper. Okay? So something like that. Okay? So imbis nga i-display nimo sa monitor, okay? What you can do is, okay? So probably we'll also need another variable. Okay? So a variable, let's call that as your C na lang. Okay? Set na to 0 and we will call this as your C na value. Okay? So isud sa ato ang for loop, C will be 0. And katong ato ang characters nga gibasa, gagamit ko og plus empty space. Okay, unsa man ang plus empty space? Parihar na diri katong pagpa-display nato. Di ba? Any numbers or any objects that are concatenated with the plus sign is converted into a string. So, what will we do with this string? Ato amang i-assign anong oper 1. What I'm actually doing here is I will add this character converted into a string to this string nako. Okay, this is what we call as the string concatenation. So mura bag nag-add ta og string dire. So when you say add the plus sign sa string, di ba mura ra man nag ing-ani guys. Kaning kabuang sa una ba nga moingon kag 1 plus 1 is equal to 11. Okay? Di ba mga tawa ta sa una no? Buang naman ni siya. 1 plus 1 11 kaklaroan lang to. But actually, that is a valid statement in C programming. Okay? So, nanay condition, it becomes 11 if 1 is a string. Manong access violation man is a string. Okay? So, if 1 is a string, nasagol na akong assembly. If 1 is a string, when you use the plus sign, what it actually does is iyahan ng isumpay. Okay? Mao nang 1 plus 1 is 11. Just like when you say 1 plus 2 is 12. Okay? That's actually valid in programming. Okay? So, kung makakita mo yung ana, okay, labi nagbata, yung anang answer, ayaw ninyo kataw eh. Okay? Kay kanang bata na advanced na kaya na siya. Nagkato na nag-programming. Okay? So, mo na siya guys. So, apparently, okay, that is how we create a string. Okay? So, katong array of characters nga to ang nakuha tag sa ato ang sanggi create into a single string o gi-add nato dire kang oper nga array. So, of course, nag-start man ta at 0. Kung makakita siya space, what do we do? Para ma-store siya sa second nga element sa string array. So, okay. So, increment C by 1. Para ang next set of array of characters, agto na pod niya ibutang sa oper 2. Okay. So, for that, problem solved. Problem solved. Okay. So, pwede ka mogamit na sa for each para lang matest na to kung na-store ba niya into two strings. Okay. So, let's say string S in oper. Okay. So, what do we do? Console dot write line. Okay. So, kinsa atong i-display dire si oper. So, para makita lang nato, ako alang butangan og dash. Okay. So, something like this. Okay. Just for me to check kung ang kaning duha ka input na sulod ba nato sa tinagsa nga string. Okay? Kay once na natay tinagsa nga string object, pwede na ta mo gamit ni convert that to int. Di ba? So, wala tay problema dira dapita. Okay? So, again, based on the input, 1, 2, 3, 4, then 1, 2. Or ato ang 5, 6 na lang dahil. Oh, nga naman to siya. Okay. Ang gi-print kaniman. Ang ato ang gibutang diri wa man tay index. Okay? CS man ato ang dapat i-print. Kay again, for each string in the collection nga offer. Okay, sorry for that. My bad. Okay, so again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there it is. Okay? Na nakay duha ka entry. Okay, so again, mao ni siya ang ako ang mag-expect nga something that you should be doing ba. Okay? With that problem. Okay? So you break it down into smaller components. So basically, if you have this one, you can also solve the other problems. Okay? Like, sa ganito nga problem nga nag-require po ng multiple inputs. Where was that? Katong order, di ba? Nga ang input nimo mo range lang from 0 to, what's that again? 0 naman, 1 to 9? 1 to 9 ba to or 1 to 6? Unsa to nga problem gani? Nalimot ko. Ang restaurant. Ang restaurant mo siguro to nga problem. Okay, katubang mamili ka og menu with the least number of orders. Okay? So again, it's basic string manipulation lang jud guys. You read it as a string and you break down it into characters and you process it one character at a time. Okay? So, kato, replace elements with greatest. Again, okay, you can use this. Okay? Pwede ni magamit, di ba? Nya, pila man to kabuk elements gani ang gibasihan ato. Wala man to ano, why limit no katong replace elements with the greatest. Bisag pila ra man to ang length. Okay? So, ang solution nimo ato is of course string man to siya imuhang basahon. So, i-convert nimo into a number. Okay? So, pwede nimo i-transfer na pod og laing array. Okay? So, pwede na ito yung ana. Okay? So, kung ano dyan siya guys, string manipulation. Okay? So, unsa ba ito nga problem kato kung giingon nga replace the greatest. Kung naman din siya standard size nga 10. Oh, so, dali ra. Di ba? Mag-create lang day ka diri og array nga 10 kabuok. Kay expected naman nga 10 kabuok values ang i-input, then you fill up which is the greatest number. Okay, so if you are able to access your code chum right now, I am referring to this problem over here. Okay, so kani ba? Okay, kahinumdum pa mo ani. Okay. So ang solution for this is of course kani basahon nimo tagsa-tagsa. Okay, so expected naman ay napo kabuok. So you just change this. Di ba? Instead of 2, expected nimo 10 man kabuok entry. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so what you do is essentially place those characters into this array. Okay, now since mas dali man manipulate nga na siya nga integer na siya daan, so instead na string, di ba, you change that to int. Int. Something like that. So as you tawag si convert daan. Okay? So, something like this. Okay? So, take note, to int requires a string value. Okay? So, kani, considered man ni as a string. Take note, si inputs with an index is considered as a character. Okay? So, we convert that character into a string by simply adding another empty string nga constant. Okay? So, again, maora ni guys, ang katong gibuhat nato, igbasa niya sa imuhang value, if dili gani siya space, so atoa siyang ibutang dire. The next time nga mobasa siya, space man na siya, so mo increment si C. So agto na siya ibutang sa address 1. Di ba? Then, of course, converted it into a number. Okay? So, upper would now be your array. So once na naka-array, di ba, it's just a matter of checking each element. Okay? So i-compare nimo ang first element sa second element. Mas dako si 2. So i-compare na pud nimo na ana kay gidada nga 2 nga value. I-compare nimo with 0, mas dako gyapon si 2. The moment maabot ka dire ni 7, mas dako man si 7 kaysa ni 2. So what will happen? Okay? So likely ang mahitabuan na before you arrive at the final answer, okay, as you traverse through each element of the array, it will now look something like this. 7, 7, 0. Okay? Di ba? So, i-check na po niya. 0, 3. Oh, mas dako gihapon si 7. So, ikabot niya, oy, mas dako gihapon si 7 ni 4. Ikabot diri, oy, mas dako gihapon si 7 ni 2. Ikabot diri, oy, mas dako gihapon si 7 ni 4. Ikabot diri, uy, mas dako si 9 kaysa ni 7. So that means you are then required to modify again the input. Okay? Something like this. Okay? So as you process your data, okay, si 1 mas dako pa man ni 0, so mailisa na pud na si 0 og 1. So ang katong dako nga value dire on the right side, may lisan og value ni 0. So again, that would be easy na lang once you already have this value, this array of integers. Okay? So ginani ra guys, ang ko na to, ang first part. Okay? You break down the string array into numerical array. Okay? Then problem solved. Okay? But of course, no, dali ra jud kaayo kung gigamitan unta to siya og split. Kay automatic dayon, i-create og split, pasa dayon sa um, array of string. Then from the array of string, i-convert din nimo tagsa-tagsa into a number. Then once number na siyang array, you process it. Okay? So, mao na siya guys. Okay? And that's it. Okay? So, that was the problem. Okay? For those na ay multiple inputs in a single line. Okay? So, mao na siya. So, anyway, again, as long as na kay magamit, there's always a solution nga pwede nimo masulbad. Though it might not be that short ang path that you take, but sure ka nga masulbad ra jud ang problema given that limited amount of tools that you have. Okay? So, mo na advantage atong naka-open sa browser kay naka-search sila kung unsaon paggamit si split, making their life pila to 8 lines of codes easier. Okay? So anyway, mao na siya guys, katong problem. Okay, hopefully you learned something from that. Okay, about how you can manipulate strings. Okay, and let's proceed to our discussion. Okay, so medyo nakuha na tong time. Where is that notes na ako ang i-prepare? Okay, now sa ato ang YouTube video, you were able to encounter these terms. Okay, nga class. Okay, what was that class again? Sa inyong nakita sa YouTube video when you talk about class? What have we learned from that YouTube video? Okay, unsa may example niya sa class? Sir, kanang nay Gucci nga bag, class na siya. Char. Okay, unsa man na? What is a class? Anyone? Okay, use your microphone. Please don't type it kay kapoy kay basa. Kapoy kay abli sa chat box. Istorya na lang, mas dali istorya. Okay?
Kuha sir ng objects nga nas like common attributes.
Unsa to? Unsa to? A
Ah,
class
murag
is
murag collection siya sa objects nga nag-share og common attributes.
a collection of objects with the same attribute. So we have to be very, very careful about kanang word nga collection. Kay kung mohisgot man gud kag collection, you are talking about array. Okay? You are talking about kaning gitawag nga mga linked list, array list. Okay? Mao na siya ang ato ang term sa collection diri sa programming. Okay? So maybe you need to modify that word kanang collection kay ma-misinterpret taan na sa word na collection. Okay? So another synonym for that word collection,
Group.
a group. Mao magyapon ng group o collection. Okay? So sige, ano ta lang, mo na si class. Okay? How about object? How do we differentiate an object from that of a class? Okay, ano to naminaw ba jud mo ni ma'am? Okay, ni ma'am kisa ti pangan ato niyang author. Ma'am Injana. Okay. How was she able to explain the concept of class and objects? Okay. Unsa may examples nga gihatag dito guys? Dali dayon open the YouTube para maka-review. Okay, yes. Oh, okay. Toyota ang attribute. Sige, sige. Padayon, padayon. Okay. So, mo na siya ang object. Okay. Okay. So, another example. Okay. So, I think that was a good example about cars. Okay. So, ang cars, mo na siya ang gitawag nato nga murag class. Okay. Now, when you talk about cars, there are different types of cars. Diba? Like, for example, one from Toyota, one from Honda, unsa pa? GAC, Hyundai, so on and so forth. Okay? But basically, all these different cars from Toyota to Honda to Hyundai to Kia to Suzuki, they all have a common attribute. Okay? So, katong term ni Canonigo ganina, attribute, and they have this common behavior. Okay? Putting them in the category under sa cars. Okay? So basically, cars is like a template. Okay? Nga ma-identify nimo ang kaning ubang so-called, ano to? Katong technical term, instance. Okay? Of the so-called objects. So, think of class DI guys as template or kanang hulmahan. Okay? Familiar mo anong term na hulmahan? Okay? Kung mag-bake mo cake, di ba? Namoy usa ka hulmahan dira. And from that hulmahan, pwede mo makakreate of different objects. In which case, okay, kung ganahan mo hulmahan nga pormang tao, ibutang ninyo dira ang inyong dough. Okay? So your dough could be vanilla flavor, could be chocolate flavor, it could be mango flavor, pineapple flavor, okay? But still, it shares the same common attribute nga parehag shape sa imong hulmahan. But each of this na nga create nimo nga object or kaning gitawag nato nga instance has their unique feature. Okay? They may all look similar nga pormang tao nga cookie, but lain-lain siya og kanang gitawag natong attribute nga naay ang usa pineapple, ang usa nay chocolate, ang usa nay mango, so on and so forth. Okay? So essentially, mao na siya ang concept sa class nga ganahan ipaibot ni Miss Indiana. Okay? So in the example, as you can see, okay, how will we translate that into a code here in C#? So we have already encountered the keyword class, and that keyword class is straight from the book, okay, on how you can implement such in C#. Okay, so let's start our topic, okay, with the keyword class. Okay, so ato arang nahibaw-an before, okay, is that if you want to declare a variable, it should be found inside the class. If you declare a method or a function, it should also be declared within a class. But what is its purpose? Okay, so again, the topic would now move forward to the topic of encapsulation. Okay, so do you still remember that term, guys? Encapsulation. Okay, so when you say encapsulation, it's just like combining the attributes, the behavior or function, okay, into a single package, just like that of a capsule. Okay, mo nang gitawag siya encapsulate. Okay, so how will class relate to that topic of encapsulation? O kanang gitawag nato nga abstraction. So kuno na siya, guys, kana nga mga terms nagtuyok-tuyok ra na siya into this topic that we will be discussing right now. Okay, so with that said, let's proceed on how to make use of class. Okay, so this will be our topics, okay, about class basics. Okay, how do we add fields, how do we add methods, and how do we modify these access levels? Kung saan yung access levels? Think of it as similar to the topic in the basic OOP about abstraction. Okay? So, di ba, when you talk about abstraction, unsa ganito yung example dito, guys, sa abstraction, ang ATM machine. Okay? So, just like in a code, okay, pwede nimo expose ang katulang mga important points for the user. And whatever code nga murag dili necessary mahibaw-an sa user, pwede nimo itago sa imong code para dili na magtanaw-tanaw ang user ato, kay ang mahitabuan na niya, it will act as a unsa na siya gitawag nato, it will act as a distraction. Okay, just like for example, if you have a car, okay, or rather if you have a cell phone, okay, sa cellphone nimo, you as a user, unsa ra importante nga dapat nimong makit-an sa imong cellphone or interface sa cellphone with you as a user? Okay, di ba? Ang importante, touchscreen, of course, na kay makita sa screen, o ang imong mga power button and ang volume button. Okay, those are the only things that you need, okay, for you to be able to interact with a cell phone. Okay, and how the cell phone actually works inside, like how the processor function, the RAM, the electronics inside it, wa na kay pakiana. Okay, So that same concept is also applicable here in OOP programming. Okay? And of course, how do you create these so-called objects? Okay? So mo na ato ang dagan sa topic ron. Now, without much said, let's move on to that keyword class. Okay? So by definition, okay, this is a definition nga gikuha nato gikan jud mismo kang Microsoft. Okay? So as stated there, a class daw is used to represent a concept in application domain. Okay? We use a class to create a new type. Okay? So again, when you talk about type, unsay mahinumduman ninyo guys? Katong crush ninyo pag grade school, type mo siya. Okay? Unsa may example sa type? Nga to ang nahibaw-an na so far. Yara, nay nag-on. Ninyo ang kon, ay ayaw mo kay kog mo kwan. Mo interact with me. Okay? Malipay ra ko ang nagmustorya mo guys. Sige. Unsa may example sa type nga inyohan nang naagian? Lahat daghan na kay tuha. Bisag usa wa jud. Okay? Unsa example sa type uy?
Katong mga int, sir, string.
Oh, kana int, string, those are data types, di ba? Type gihapon na siya. Data types, okay? So with class, you have the ability to create your own type. Okay? So laliman ka na ikay maghimo sa imong type. Di na ka mag-agad ni bisang kinsa. Okay? So class basically contains data and operation, and it is one of those fundamentals in the object-oriented programming concept. Okay? So how do you use a class? Again, to use a class, you simply define the keyword class, then the class name. Okay, of course, when you are choosing your class name, be guided by what? By the rules in creating variable names. Okay, now what have you noticed, guys, with all these class names that you see in front of you? O wala pa di ay. Okay, so what have you noticed with these so-called class names?
Start of capital letter.
The start of capital letter. What else? Aside from starting with capital letters, you have noticed something else based on the given example?
One word, sir.
One word. Okay. What else? Okay. Ano ito makahinaminog pa ba? So this was a topic before in C. Okay. This is one of the notations na common kayo in the programming world. Okay. So when you have a variable name, di ba, that starts with a small letter, then for the next word, capital letter, we call it as camel notation. Okay? But for class, unsay gigamit na notation when it starts with a capital letter. Okay? What kind of notation is that? Anyone remembers? Starts with a P. Unsa to? Pascal. Okay. So this is the Pascal notation. Okay. Hopefully you still remember that ha. Yung lagi kalimta ang mga kaniadto nato. Okay. Mora ning panahon na nga dapat din ninyo i-apply ang past is past. Okay. Sige. Now, inside the class, unsa may expected na itong makita. Okay? So, this is like synonymous with the so-called attributes. Okay? So, as stated here, class instance field stores object state. Okay? So each instance will have its own copy and all are basically called instance variable. So ganina nakadungog ta nga gigamit ang word nga instance. Okay? So basically an instance is what you call as a result of creating an object out of your class. Okay? And that process of creating an object out of the class is what we call as instantiation. Okay? Now, what actually happens when you have this so-called instance field? Okay, so as it's stated there, guys, kaning nga mga field, okay, will have its own copy. So that means if you create an object out of this class, okay, the value of the name, price, and share is independent from the other objects. Okay, so just like for example, when you talk about fruits, di ba? So a fruit will have a shape, it will have a taste, it will have a color. Okay, if you create an object out of the fruit, you can come up with an apple, a mango, a papaya. Okay, each of these fruits will have their own shapes, independent of the others. Okay, it will also have different taste, independent of the other fruits. Okay, now how do we create an object out of this so-called class? Okay, so to create an object, which is also called an instance, we make use of the so-called instantiation or also known as the activation. And unsay gigamit nato nga keyword to create an instance? We use the keyword new. Okay? Nakabantay mo ani guys. Okay, when you are creating an array, 'di ba? Naggamit ta og keyword new. Okay? So with the keyword new di ay maoday na ang pamaagi to create a new object. Now what actually happens when you make use of the keyword new? Okay? Now, ambot lang kung naka-remember pa mo, it was just a short discussion about memory management when we were discussing C. Okay? Now, every time that you create a variable in C, okay, you have this so-called stack memory. Okay? Most of those variables that you have created as is placed on the stack memory. Okay? Now, when you make use and create an object, okay, what happens there is that these objects are not created in the stack, but they are created in the so-called heap memory. Okay? So naa diri gi-create ang kana nga variables and ana siya ni occupy og space sa heap memory. Okay? So when you assign that new object to this variable, basically it creates a link, okay, between the so-called variable and this object created in the heap. Okay? So, ing-ana ang nahitabuan na niya, guys. Okay? So, dili siya nakabutang sa stack, but nakabutang siya sa heap. So, later, atuan niya na discuss. Unsa man ang heap na memory. Okay? So, sa heap memory, ang advantage ng heap memory is that bisag asa na siya pwede ibutang. Okay? So, as long as na empty space, you can create more objects, and for you to be able to access that object, that space in the memory, you need to hook that up with a variable. So let's say si Sanba. Okay? So mo na siya gi-assign na nimo. Okay? So ingan na ang style when you are working with class and when you are creating an instance or the so-called objects. Okay? So let's say you have this so-called class, gitawag natong stack. Okay? So we have these fields, the name, the price, and the share. So essentially, dito sa heap memory nimo, okay, it creates a space there to where those data are stored. Okay, so even though they have the same name for each fields, those actually doesn't conflict with the other fields of another object. Okay, mo nang giingon dire nga it gets its own copy. Okay, dili siya mag-share. Okay, so mo na siya ang nature sa kaning gitawag nato nga objects. Okay, and for us to access these fields, okay, kana siya, kani sila nga mga fields, we make use of your dot operator. Okay, the same way we access the functions and properties sa atoang class. Okay, pero probably mahibong mo, sir, kato laging naggamit ta og convert. Okay, ni diretso lagi ko gamit sa to int nga function without creating an instance. Okay, so that's actually a special case. Okay, for you to access these fields, you are required to always create an instance of that object. The same is true if you add methods, but there is an exception there. For example, katong convert class nato, di ba? Ni diretso ra ta gamit sa method without creating an instance, and we will be explaining that later. Okay, how that was made possible. Okay, so aside from those so-called fields nga ato ang ma-add sa class, you can actually also add behaviors. So again, when you talk about behaviors, it is just synonymous with the word method. Or kung sa C pa, it's more common to us as functions. Okay? So mo na si behavior, mo na si method, mo na si function. They are used interchangeably here. Okay? So kamuray bahala unsay kuan ninyo, unsay tawag ana, unsay komportable ninyo gamitaw. But same ra na sila og concept. Okay? So we are already familiar with the return type of a method, di ba? Nakaagi naman ta ani sa C. Same ra na siya when you declare a method inside a class. Okay, the same rules apply. You could use any data type here. You can have multiple parameters or no parameters at all in the parameter list. Okay, so practically the same ra jud na siya ang methods sa C# ug C. Ang kalahian lang, those functions must be encapsulated inside the class. Okay? Kaya again, sa pagkaingong object-oriented programming, okay, we use the class to define our object. Okay? Kaya once you create an object, ang katong mga fields, kaning mga behaviors, are defining what an object is. Okay? And that is the reason why, guys, dili pwede ang global variables. You cannot have a field nga moingon kag int x outside the class. Kaya essentially, unsa na si x? What kind of information is that? Di mo ma-associate with an object. Di ba? So, let's say you have a function here. You have a function. Let's say void play. Okay? Nya, wala siya masud sa class. Would it make sense? Okay? Do you see a behavior nga murag maglutaw-lutaw sa hangin? Di ba? There's no such thing. Okay? And even attribute, like let's say string color. Di makakitag attribute nga color nga naglutaw-lutaw lang sa hangin. Di ba? It should belong to a certain object when you talk about colors. Di ba? When you talk about behavior. So let's say moingon kag naay nag-aw-aw. O kabaw day ka, it belongs to an object na dog. Di ba? Or nay nanimaho. O kabaw na kaasa na nimo ma-associate ang nanimaho. So probably a person or something gigawas sa person. Di ba? So that's the object. Okay? Aw na to ludon ba ang nagkaon? Wa giluod, wa giluod. Okay ra. Ako lang to gitry kung naminaw ba naminaw jud eh. Okay. So anyway, how do you invoke? Again guys, when you say invoke, it's synonymous with how you call a method. Okay? So take note ha, the keyword. When you hear or when you encounter that word invoke here in C# programming, okay, that word invoke is synonymous with the word call. So when you say invoke a method, it is just synonymous with call the method. Okay? So how do you call a method's name? So as stated here, okay, before you can call a method, you need to create an object. You need to create an instance. Once you have created an instance, then you can access its so-called method. Okay? So again, mubalik na sa itong question, ngano lagi to si convert that to int, sir? Wa lagi ko mag-create ato og object or wa lagi ko mag-create atong instance. Okay? So again, ato ara na explain later, maabot ra niya taan ang topic. Okay? So evidently, okay, you have here a class nga naanay fields ug naanay behavior. Again, behavior is just synonymous with functions or methods. Fields is just synonymous with attributes. Okay? Or so-called properties. Okay? So as stated in this example, okay, there is this keyword called this. Okay? Unsa man ang keyword nga this. Now, this keyword guys is applicable not just in C# but also in Java. Okay? And what do we use the keyword this for? So, this could really come in handy when you are working with classes. Okay? Unsa man na si this. Okay? So, we use that to handle object on which method was called, and it will be used to access members from inside the method. So let's say for instance, this is the member. Okay, this is the field. This is the attribute kaning si share inside your class. Okay, so if you want to use kaning a field inside your method, okay, actually this in this example is optional. You may and may not use the keyword this when you want to access this field sa imong class. Okay? Question is, when therefore do we use the keyword this? Okay? So magamit na nimong this if there is a conflict with your member name. Like let's say for example, this is your attribute, the field sa imong class. And somewhat, when you were creating your function, you have used that same name, okay, sa imong parameter sa imong function. Okay? Now, we do know that if you make use of share inside the function, this share will actually be referring to this one. So how will you differentiate kani nga variable name from the field attribute name? Okay? That is when you make use of the keyword this. So when you use the keyword this, it simply implies that this is a field for the class or common sa class. Okay? So, mo na pasabot anang this diri guys. Okay? So, if you make use of this share, this variable share, without the keyword this, then you know that it is just a local variable, local to this function. But when you say this, kaning variable name will be referring to this variable which is common to the entire class. Okay? So again, this is something nga wala sa C nga programming language. Okay? But that is common sa Java and C# nga programming language. Okay? So if ever gani, okay, walay conflict sa paggamit ni mo nga field, okay? Then again, as what I said earlier, it's not mandatory that you always put the keyword this because makabawra si compiler since there is no more conflict of this variable name. The compiler knows that the share that you are talking about is referring to the field attribute. Okay? So, manay gitawag na to. Class members access implicitly. So, when you say implicitly, there's no need for intervention from the programmer. Unlike when you say explicitly. Diba? Just like explicit conversion. When you say explicit conversion, kailangan jud magbutang o typecast ang programmer. Okay? So, next. So, member declaration order. Okay, so as stated here, there is no requirement to declare before the use. Okay? So, as you can see, this is something nga dili common sa C#. Kaya sa C#, before you can use that variable, you need to identify or declare it first. Okay? But as you can see in the code, guys, makita nimo si share dire, it has been used by this function even before it was declared. Okay? In C, that would actually generate an error kay di niya mailhan ang word nga share nga gigamit nimo before it was even declared. But in C#, that is not an issue. Okay? So, pwede ra jud na nimo gamiton before nimo na siya giila-ila. Okay? So, again, that is only applicable to your attributes sa imong class. Okay? But if you will be referring to local variables, that's a different story. Okay? So if you say local variable, that means if you're using here this variable, let's say k baron, okay, imbis nga s, k atong gigamit dire, it should also be declared before the line where it was used. Okay? Mo nang gipasabot ani, different rule than local variables. Dili pwede nga mogamit ka before declaring the variable. Again, this is only applicable for attributes of your class or members of your class nga gigamit nimo within sa function. Okay? So, dili ra issue ang order of declaration. Okay? So, unsa pa man. Of course, when you want to create a function, you might want to create a function that is capable of returning a value, given that, of course, ang return type nimo is dili void. So, just like in C, you have that keyword return. Okay? Again, common rin na siya sa C. Okay? So, ato lang na siyang gi-review nga again, when you're talking about functions in C and C#, almost dili siya different from each other. Okay? So, nalay mga rules nga napuno. So, the rules nga gigamit nato in C still is applicable here in C#. But of course, with minor modification. Okay? So, naapasad ni siya guys. Usa ka nindot nga feature here in C# is kaning gitawag nato nga method overloading. Okay? Unsa maning method overloading. It means you can have several methods with the same name. This is something we can't do with C. Mo-error ni siya. Okay? And this, guys, is the very reason why if you try to make use of the so-called um, IntelliSense, okay? So let's say, for example, when you use kanila sigurong right line, okay? So you might have noticed this, okay? If you are using Sharp Develop or if you are using Visual Studio, makabantay mo unsa man nga number 1 of 19. What does it mean? Okay? So makabantay ka right line diri walay sulod. Pero igamit lagi ni sir, butangan lagi string. But if you click on this small triangle here, 29, makakita mo nga there's an implementation of the method writeLine that accepts a boolean value, a character value, okay, a character array, an array of character, okay, naapoy an array of character with parameters like for example the index and the count, okay, naapod siya function wherein mudawat og decimal value. And as you can see here, there are 19 different ways a right line function is utilized. So dili lang puro string ang imuhang ibutang dira sa imuhang right line. It could be a string format, okay, with objects, okay, which is the typical nga to ang gigamit-gamit if ever gani mag-print ta og string, okay, katong pina-print if og style ba, okay. So there's so many ways to implement right line, okay. This here is what you call as method overloading, okay. You can have several methods sharing the same method name, okay. Unsa may requirement for you to be able to perform method overloading? You only need to have a parameter list which are different ang sulod. Mo nang makabantay mo dito, guys, out of the 19 different ways of implementing that right line method, lain-lain siya og parameter list, di ba? Naay blanco, naay mo accept og boolean, naay mo accept og string, naay mo accept og integer, so on and so forth. Okay? So, take note lang, you cannot overload on the return type. Okay? So, dapat parihara og return type kanang method. Okay? But, again, pwede mag-usab-usab ang inyong parameter list. Okay? And that is the method overloading. Okay? So, pwede mo try ana, guys. Okay? So, if you try to make use of a method, let's say, unsa mga method ato ang i-create dire. Okay? So, let's say, void f1. Okay? So, this is a method that does nothing at all. Okay? So, you have another method, void. Okay? So you have void f1, but it accepts an integer. Okay? So kung maggamit ka ng f1, if you do a function call, okay? So if you do a function call, so maingon ka og this baron that f1. Okay? So makita din ninyo diri, guys, oh. Okay? That my f1 function actually has what? Two overloads. It can be called without a parameter. It also can be called with a parameter nga integer. Okay? So, mo na siya guys. Okay? So, again, okay, that is the concept of, what you call that again? Method overloading. Okay? So, pwede nimo mausab-usab how your method is implemented depende sa parameters nga imong isupply sa method. Okay, next. Okay, value parameter. Okay, unsa man ang value parameter? Basically, pare-pareha ra sad ni siya sa ato ang discussion on C. Okay, so take note, when you pass a value on your parameter list, it is pass by value by default. Unsa may pasabot anang pass by value? That means if you are to pass this variable to this function f, you will actually only have a copy of y. Okay, so which is 9. So internally, okay, when you call that function, ang nahitabuan na niya, when you pass the value y, mura ra naging ani guys. Okay, so x is equal to y. Okay, ing ani ra na ang nahitabo diri kani, same ra ni siya. So you only got a copy of y to x. Okay, so if you modify the function inside that, if you modify the variable x inside the function, it only affects the variable x. It doesn't affect the y variable. Kaya you only are modifying a copy of that data. Okay? So, mao na siya ang ato ang gitawag nga default parameter passing mechanism sa ato ang method. Okay? Now, there's actually a way for you to modify how you pass parameters sa imong function. Okay? We use the keyword ref. Okay? If you want to modify the parameter passing nga pass by reference. Okay? As stated here, the ref parameter passes data in and out of your function. Okay? So, unsa may pasabutan ng ref. Okay? So, take note, when you use the keyword ref in the parameter list, ang mahitabuan ni guys is that the moment you modify the value of x inside this function, not only will x be modified, but also the variable nga ato ang gipasa sa ato ang function. Okay? So as you look at this example, okay, pagtawag nato ni function h, gi-modify nato ang default parameter passing sa ato ang function by the keyword ref. Okay? So what will happen here is that when the x value inside the function is modified, that changes acquired by x will also be passed sa variable to where it was referenced to. Okay? So in this example, as you see, si x gi-assign na nato sa variable y, but gagamit ang keyword nga reference. We multiplied x by 2. Okay? So x here becomes pila man. So obviously, ang original value ni y is 9. So this is equal to 9. So 9 times 2. So x now becomes 18. Take note, with the keyword ref, any changes nga gibuhat nimo kang x will be cascaded to the variable referencing the variable x. Okay? So, mahimong 18 si y. Okay? So, this is actually equivalent to the topic of pointers in C. Okay? Kung sa C lang, okay, medyo labad-labad ang style sa C kay there are operators that you need to use when you want to implement that function. Okay? In C, ani ang implementation ana niya sa C, guys. Okay, so given that, okay, you have that void, so to, void H. Okay, so int x, okay, so take note, when you create a function like this, x is equal to x times 2, okay, so on the main program, okay, you did a function call for h, like let's say int y is equal to 9, and then you call the function h, gipasahan nimo sa variable y, okay, this here would result to a y still having the value of 9, di ba? And x here will have a value of pila? 18. Okay? So, mo ni sa C nga ito ang hibawan, which is passed by value. Okay? Now, if you want a similar operation of this in C, okay, you will be making use of pointers. So, yung ani ang syntax na niya in C. You make use of the asterisk sign. Okay? So, having that asterisk sign, okay, if you want to access the value where this variable is pointing at, you make use also of the asterisk value here, and you assign the value again using the asterisk sign. Okay, and when you do a function call, you actually put an ampersand here. Okay, this is how you do it in C when you talk about pass by reference. Okay, unsa ni gamit anang ampersand? Maklaro ba ninyo? Ang gamit anang ampersand diri, guys, is that imbis ang ihatag niya sa value ni x is ang 9 nga value ni y, ang ipasa niya kang x is ang address to where y is located in the memory. Okay? Nya unsa man ning gitawag nato nga asterisk before the x. This is what we call in C as indirection operator. What it actually does is that with this asterisk operator, agtuon niya ang address nga gipasa nimo. Og from that address, kung asa located si y, kuhaon niya ang value. Okay? So, just to illustrate, okay, para medyo masabtan ninyo what is happening here when you say pass by reference. Okay? So, kung anin ang mahitabuan, guys. Okay? So, ato lang na-explain para na mo idea unsa ng pass by reference o pass by value. Take note, x here is acting like a pointer. Okay, a pointer to a memory location. So let's say cy. This is your memory. Okay, so you declare y in the memory. This is y. So let's say this location in the memory is naa sa 1,000. Okay, so gisudlan na nimo og 9. Okay, now when you assign a value of ampersand y to x, okay, let's say this is your x, the pointer x, okay, That is the pointer x. What you put here in x, okay, with the help of the keyword ampersand, is actually not the value of y, but the address of y. So, ang gibutang nimo na is kani, where y is located in the memory. Okay? So, when we call this expression, okay, what actually happens here is that this asterisk symbol allows you to visit that location where y is located. And it gets the value of y, which is 9. So, pag multiply nimo ni 9 by 2, again, gigamitan na pud nimo asterisk diri si x. So that means muadto na pud ka where y is located and you put the result. Okay? So it becomes 18. So that's why when you go out of the function, this actually becomes 18 na because you modified the value of y and not just a copy of y. Okay? So, kung magtanaw mo, okay, that is how we do it in C. Mao day wa na ma-discuss. Okay? So, actually, this is one of the topics that most students are dreading. Okay? Di sila ganahan makakitag ing ani. Okay? But unfortunately, ikahuman nato sa UOP, ikabot nato sa first semester next year, mag-agi mo ani. And you will even encounter something like naapay ikaduhang asterisk. Okay? So again, masabtan ra na ninyo guys with the concept of pass by reference. Okay? So in C sharp, imagine, dali na lang kaayo. Okay? If you want nga ang variable mismo may ma-modify inside this function, imagine, unsa ray ibutang ninyo. Okay? Di ba sa ako ang program in C ganina, daghan kay ko giusab no? Nagbutang pa kog asterisk, nagbutang pa kog ampersand. Pero when you do it here in C sharp, is just a matter of adding the keyword ref when you declare the method or when you define the method. And when you call the method, it's just as simple as, again, making use of the keyword ref. Okay? Ing ana ra ang iyahang pass by reference. Okay? So of course, that is applicable to all primitive data types. Unsa man ang primitive data types? Kauban is mga unggoy, primitive. Okay? So dili. Okay? Gitawag na silang primitive data types typically because they are value types. Okay? Unsa na silang value types? So later atuara niya nang i-discuss. Kaya aside from value types, makaagi pa jud mo og kaning gitawag nato nga reference types. Okay? So which are basically katong gitawag nato nga objects. Okay? So mora na itiman nato no, when you talk about value types, adto na siya ibutang sa stack ang kana nga mga variables. When you talk about objects or kanang gitawag nato nga reference type, it is placed on the heap memory. Okay? So, sige lang guys. Atuaran yan ng agian. Okay? So, very broad ang mga terminologies dere. Okay? So, anyway, with that said, let's proceed. Okay? Another way of modifying how your function pass your parameters. Okay? So, kung walay mga keyword gi-add, again, by default, that is pass by value. Okay? If you want a pass by reference, you add the keyword ref. But, okay, take note, but napay katulo ang out parameter, okay, which is used to return data through the parameter. Okay? Unsa man siyang out, sir? So, actually, an out keyword is just a watered down version ni ref nga keyword. kang ref nga keyword manggod, pwede siya maka-update sa sulod, pwede pod nimo ma-update ang naa sa gawas. Okay? However, when you talk about the out keyword, kaning ipasa nimo nga variable y, okay, should never appear on the right side of the equation. Okay? Unsa maning value ni y? Again, that is the x value. So that means when you use x must always be located on the left-hand side. Okay? Kay nganong left-hand side man? From the word out manggod. So when you say out, you can only pass a value to this variable. So when you pass a value in this variable, that means it could affect the variable outside the function. Thus, it's called out parameter. Okay? Dili siya pwede gamiton nimo si x, like let's say for example, na akay i-compute nga y using the value of x. Di na siya pwede. Okay? Kay otherwise, you are using this variable to pass an input sa function. Okay? So maguba ang ihang definition nga out parameter lang siya. Okay? So mo na guys ang difference between out and ref. Si ref bidirectional. Pwede nimo mabasa sa sud sa function, pwede pud nimo magamit to modify the value outside the function. Si out nga keyword is only utilized to generate an output or to modify the variable outside the function. Okay? So, kung ako'y pabuot huna-hunaon, I'll just use ref na lang kay bidirectional, di ba? Okay? However, there are cases manggod wherein people use out to ensure lang nga this variable is not gonna be used inside the function. It only acts as a means for you to generate multiple outputs. Kaya di ba when you talk about methods, you can only return one value based on yung return type. Now what if you are to return multiple values? Unsaon man na nimo? Okay, so C# provides you with that solution, making use of the keyword out. Okay? Taas sa pa niya. Sige, padayon lang ta. Okay, so anyway, hopefully you are still digesting the things that I'm saying, guys. Okay? Kaya pa? Matun pa? Sige, usap lang dira, usap lang. Okay? Next, member default access. Okay? So, money guys, ang ato ang means when we provide an abstraction, okay, to our classes. Okay? This is what we use, okay, to create this so-called data hiding. Okay? Now, typically when you declare a method, di ba, by default, you just simply type in the data type, then the variable name, and that's it. Okay? Pero as you can see here in this example, what have you noticed? Okay? Kana ding mag-declare ka og data type, then the variable name, or the return type, then the function name, naa din ni siya imaginary nga member default access before niya. Okay? So implicitly, okay, when you declare a field name or a function or a method, by default, naa na siya access nga private. Okay? Pero wala lang nato gipakita ganina sa atong example. kay it is a known information that if you don't specify the access towards this field or function, it is by default in private. Okay? So, unsa din ng private? Okay? So, kung nay private, unsay atbang aning private?
Public, sir.
Public. Okay? Naapod tay keyword nga public. Okay? So, para masabtan na to si public, unsa din na si private. Okay. So, when you say a member is private, you limit your code only in that class. Okay? So, for instance, okay, I have here duha ka class. Ang class nako si stack, ug I also have a class called test. Okay? So, this time, I have two class na, di ba? Unlike before, nga usa-usa lang. So, in this example, by default, atuan ni siyang define as private. Okay? Now again, if you don't define that field share as private, by default, it will be treated as private by the compiler. The same is true with your function. Okay? Now, if you want to create an object of this class, again, we just make use of the keyword new, di ba? And make use of the dot operator to access its member. However, doing this would result in an error. Kay nganong error man? Again, unsay gamit sa keyword nga private? Okay? It limits, okay, the access to this member. Okay? And it can only be accessed within the class. So, kanang share dire, since naara manggihapon na siya within the class stack, pwede rin na nimo magamit si share. But if another class attempts to access that field, it will generate an error. Kaysa pagkangan lang ba, nga giingnan, imuha na gud nang gibutangan og private. So that means, other objects are not allowed to access those information. Okay? So, na-relate na ninyo karon guys sa topic on OOP. Okay? That is how you provide the so-called data hiding. Okay? So, essentially, if you want other objects to access this information, you need to declare them as, guess what? Okay? Unsay dapat natong i-declare for these fields and method if you want other objects access it?
Public.
We declare them as public. Okay? So, mo na gamit sa public. Okay? By using the keyword public, you are exposing this part of your class to outside class. Okay? So, kani, name, prices, and share, only the class stack ang naay access ani nga mga attributes. Okay? So, if there's another object here that tries to access this information, they will not be able to do so. Okay? So, for example, parihara pod nato, di ba? Let's say, ang access nimo is taman ra sa imuhang screen sa cellphone or button sa cellphone nga power o volume up o volume down. Okay? So, if you try to open the cellphone, unsay mahitabo? Error. Unsay error? Void ang warranty. Okay, you are not supposed to access that part of the cell phone because you as a user, should only be limited unta dira sa mga button, sa touchscreen o sa different ports of your phone. Okay? So mao pud na sa programming, and this is how you provide this so-called abstraction sa imuhang objects. Okay? So pwede ra di ay kanira i-expose nimo to other users. So other, when you say other user, it's like expose nimo to other class or to other objects. Okay? So are things now going into place? Okay? Base sa inyong nakita sa previous video. Okay? Nasabtan ra ninyo ang concept sa encapsulation and abstraction and what class really is and how it is implemented in C#. Okay? So if medyo naglibog-libog, okay, don't be shy to ask questions. Okay? Sige, padayon ta. Hapit na ta, mahuman, for this part of the discussion about class. Okay? So, typically, with the help of these access modifiers, okay, we are able to control the access levels, okay, that are used to separate the interface from the implementation. So, when you say interface, these are the things that are accessible outside that class. So that means kani si buy, sell, set price, value, those are your interface towards this object. Okay? So ang implementation is diri na dapita kani hidden. Okay? So sir, is it possible that I could set this field as public? Yes. Pwede ra. Okay, but you have to think, does the other user need this information? Di ba? Mao na ang question. Does the other user need this information? If no, then there's no point in making it public because it will just confuse the user or the other objects. Okay? So typically, okay, interface are made public and implementations are made private. How about a function, sir? Is it also possible that I have a function here nga private? Yes. Okay, it is possible that you have a function nga private. Okay? Okay, just like for example, you as a person, you are an object. Okay? Unsa may pinaka-interface nimo? Okay? So, of course, going in and out, you have your eyes to see for information to get inside you. You have your mouth, which is bidirectional. Di ba? Pwede siya mo generate og sound. Pwede po siya mo accept og input. Og unsa man nga input? Pagkaon ba ron? Tubig ba ron? Di ba? So those are your major interface sa imong body. Then what about kung may mga private methods, sir? Okay? Unsa may example ana? Like let's say for example, how you digest your food. Di ba? Digestion is like a behavior that is happening inside your body. But does other people need to know about that? How you digest your food, di ba? Why paki ang tao? So, ingana guys, okay? Ang idea sa access modifiers, okay? Now, we have only touched two. There's actually other access modifier aside from public and private, and we will tackle them later as we move along with the discussion. Okay, so one bit at a time para di kayo mo ma-overwhelm. Okay, okay, naa pa ni internal, naa pa ni protected, so on and so forth. Okay, so again, kana siya. Okay, separation allows implementation to be easily changed without breaking the user's code, and of course it is basically one of the principle in OOP. Okay, the concept of encapsulation. Okay, so again, revisiting the naming guidelines that we have encountered earlier. When you declare your class name, use intercaps, okay, with initial as capital. Okay, and this is what we also commonly refer to as the, what's ito? Pascal notation. Okay? So when you are making methods, basically, intercaps with initial as capital. Basically, equivalent ra pod sa Pascal notation. Okay? So when you are using parameters, okay, inside your method, what do we use? So intercaps with initial lowercase, also known as, unsa ni siya nga notation? Intercaps niya with initial lowercase. Unsa man na siya? Lawa dyan na duba, grabe.
Camel notation,
Oh,
sir.
to rasos, grabe. Usa na lang ka letter. Okay? Camel notation. Okay? So that is how you define your parameters inside your methods. Okay? So for public fields, okay, you make use of intercaps with initial as capital. Okay? So in short, you use Pascal notation. For private field, you use intercaps with lowercase, which is again camel notation. Okay, so as you can see here in the example, here is an example of a public field nga nagamit og Pascal notation. Okay, so intercaps with initial capital. However, if you have declared that field to be private, intercaps with initial as lowercase. Okay, so mo na pasabutan na guys. La intercaps with initial, intercaps with initial as lowercase. Okay? So naming convention. So as a summary sa atong discussed earlier with classes, take note, class is the basic unit of C# programming. Okay? As stated, we are talking about object-oriented programming, so it is impossible to create a program without a class. Okay? Because if you don't have a class, then therefore you don't have an object. So if you don't have an object, then you cannot call it as object-oriented programming. Okay? Now, there are several ways to pass your parameters, and one of those is the default, which is pass by value. Okay? So kung naa kay ganahan nga bidirectional ang pag-pass sa parameter, that means it could affect the variable of being passed, you make use of out. But if you also want that the variable being passed can also be read inside the method, you use the keyword ref. Okay? And again, there are several options for protection level of class members, and we have only discussed two. Okay, so far, si private ug si public. Okay? So later as we move along with the discussion, kanang managhan na ng objects ato ang i-create, madaghan na ato ang class gi-declare, we'll tackle on those different access modifier nga pwede gamiton. Okay? Okay. Yara. Next topic. Okay. So actually napamantay ko no? Napatay Monday di ay. Okay. So next week will be our guess. Guess unsay naa sa unsay naa next week.
Continue og discuss sir.
No, continue to discuss. Prelim sad ta, oy.
April.
Prelim na next week, oy. Okay.
Postpone na daw sir next year.
Next year, same subject. Okay, ra, ganahan mo. Pass na kung kwan. Jesus, talking about grades, so pa kumahuman og check. My God. Di na ko mo palabot ani. Sandaan jud to si Odette nga nung na setback ang checking sa exams o activities nga no bitang nag-online. Okay, so anyway, padayon ta sa ato ang discussion. let's now talk about initialization. Okay? So, initialization. Ano sa ganitong initialization? Okay? So, initialize. When you want to initialize, okay, an object, unsa may mahitabo. Okay? Or when you create an instance of the object, okay, unsa may mahitabo. Are they are there ways to modify how your object is created? Okay? So that will be discussed in this topic. Okay? Now, before anything else, let's try to review again the so-called fields. Okay? Fields of your object or the instance fields. Okay? So when talking about instance fields, okay, when you don't set it with an initial value, the compiler will set a default value for that. Okay? So especially if those are so-called value types or kaning gitawag na to nga primitive data types. Okay? So for numerical values, it will be initialized to a value of 0. If it's a Boolean data type, it will have an initial value of false. If it's a character, it will have this value, 0, 0. And for reference types, okay, it will have a value of null. Okay, unsa man ang value of null? Or what are reference types? Okay, so example of reference types, guys, is kaning gitawag nato nga objects. Okay, so as what I've discussed earlier, how will you know if it's a reference type? Okay, usually these so-called reference types makes use of keyword nga new. Just like when you create an instance of your class, diba? You make use of the keyword new. Those data are created in the heap memory. Okay, so those are what we typically refer to as reference types, and they are um, assigned a default value of null. Unsa man ang pasabutan ng null, sir? Okay, so in C, when you say null, it's like equivalent to nothing at all. Okay, so let's say for example, okay, you have kani rational A, new rational. Okay, you have created here an object. So essentially, inside your computer, you have here a variable A. And this variable A contains the location of the object nga rational here. Okay? So, connected na siya to a memory location that contains kani the numerator and the denominator nga values and whatever values that are of your rational object. Okay? Now, if let's say for example, you simply declare a variable, let's say rational B. Okay? You have created a variable for this class B. Okay? So that is actually placed here. Okay? In your stack memory. However, it is not pointing to any location that would contain the information or the data for the numerator and denominator. Okay? Now, if you don't initialize this, it might be pointing randomly everywhere. And you don't want that, di ba? Nga magpataka lang panudlo bisag asa. You might be accessing that information na wala ma-initialize and it could cause your program to crash. Okay? So, if nag-declare kag variable lang without creating an object, might as well set that to a value of null. Okay? So, when you say null nga value, okay, ang compiler mo say na ana nga, oy, this variable is not pointing to anything. Okay? So, this variable does not represent any significant object. Okay? So, manay pasabot ana guys when you say null. Okay? So, wala ra siya gikuan, wala ra siya mo-occupy og space sa heap memory. Okay? So, those are the instance field default values. Okay? So, pwede din na, sir, nga mag-create kog class. So, ani? Yes. Okay? So, you could declare here as a field member ang class. Nga, let's say, for example, katong di-create ganina, unsa to, stack, di ba? So, pwede ka mag-create dira. Okay? Og field nga class. Okay? So, that's basically the power of the keyword class. Okay? You can create your own data type and you can create your own type. Okay? So, making your coding more flexible o dili ka limited to the so-called value types or the primitive types like int, di ba? Float, doubles. Okay, you can actually create your own type with the help of class. Okay? So, napod tay gitawag nga pag-initialize og fields. Okay? So, just like when you make use of initializer. So, when you put an initial value for your fields, take note, each time that you create a new object, okay, this part of the code will be executed, okay, giving you a means to overwrite the default value set by the compiler. Okay, so for example, di ka ganahan nga ang denominator would have a default value of 0. Okay, nganong di mo ko ganahan ma 0 si denominator. Take note, when you divide a value with 0, what happens?
Undefined, sir.
Undefined. Okay, so it could actually cause your program to crash. Okay, kay division of 0. Okay, so mo nang there are cases di ay that you need to initialize your fields with the value nga dili lang ang default value. Okay, so pwede ra na siya. So every time mag-create ka og object from this class rational, all those instances will have a value based on your initialization nga gibuhat. Okay. Next, okay. Kani karon. Class can also supply constructor to do initialization. Now, usually when you create an object, it's just a matter of using the keyword new, di ba? Then call the class name. Then open close parenthesis. Okay, that's how we create our object. Okay, now it is actually possible for you to modify the so-called constructor. So kani katong nitawag ta sa new rational, that is the default constructor. Okay, so sa pagkangang default, that means you don't need to implement that. Okay, now you could actually create your own constructor na pwede nimong gamiton every time you create an object. Like let's say for instance, instead of creating the object with its default values, then you access the fields one at a time, why not just create a constructor wherein you can pass the value? Okay? So that when your object is created, it will have this value initializing the members of your object. Okay? So, pwede na siya. Okay? So, can I have also a constructor, sir, nga denominator lang ang parameter? Yes. You need not have all these fields be part of the parameter list for your constructor. Okay? So, pwede ra na siya, guys. Okay? So, that topic again is related to unsa ganito na topic before nga pwede ka ka-create og multiple methods. Unsa to? Method overloading. Okay? Now, what makes this different from the typical method nga gi-discuss nato earlier? Okay? The difference between the method nga ato ang gi-create earlier was the name given to the method. Kabantay mo? The name is making use of the class name. And what else have you noticed from the syntax? Let me clear that up. Okay? What else have you noticed, guys? What's the difference sa method nga to ang na-discuss earlier compared to this one? Napo ba'y lain? Napo mo'y nabantayan? Di, ang mga himantayon. Dali, pamantay mo. Sige.
Kaduha nag-declare sir.
Kaduha nag-declare og unsa. What do you mean kaduha nag-declare?
Kanang kuan sir, kanang int numerator niya. So sud sa doon na sir, ga-in sa siya sir.
Int numerator. You mean this one?
Oh, kanang int numerator niya sa bobo sa doon na niya sir.
Sa babaw po ani.
Kaduha,
Okay.
ga-in.
Di ba naman ni sa topic on methods nga kani nga numerator is the one used inside, whereas this numerator is practically a different variable referring to the field member. So these two, even though they share the same name, are treated differently. Okay? So nani siya sa kuan na to, previous example. Okay? The this keyword. Okay? Wala mo daing nabantayan? Di, come on. Mga himantayon. Sige. Siga ang mata. Okay? Ayaw mo pagkinurian. Char. Papiyong-piyong dayon para ng Koreano look. Char. Sige, wala dyan yung nabantayan. Kamuha, limot-limot mo ha. Kung sa may bantayan na ninyo if you are creating a method. Yeah, I already said that earlier. What else? Wala dyan lang nabantayan. What are the requirements when you create a method? Hello, ano dyan sila kahinumdum.
Ang public sir.
Ang public. Ang method, dili ta pwede ka gamit og public sa mga method. Pwede, di ba? That is how we modify the access privileges or access rights. Okay? So when you say public, so that means kanang si rational, pwede nimo magamit outside the rational class. So pwede magamit sa laing object. Okay, unsa pa man? Wala, grabe, wala din sila kabantay.
Ay tulog ka daw sir eh.
Naitulog ka dat. Uy, sa may tulog ka dat. Uy, dat mo na. Pasabot na, naapay code. Pwede nimo ibutang after ana. What else? Focus on that so-called constructor. How does it differ from the so-called method? La, kamuha, bantay lang. Prelim biya next meeting. Be, what? Come on. Be, manawag daw ta ha, manawag ta. Lucero. Okay, kindly turn on your camera please. Tawagan na to sa Lucero. Okay, wag niyo kita ning Lucero. Kay wa mag-on sa camera. Nagdagan-dagan si Lucero kay nagluto pa di ay ito. Tora. Inom nagtubig si Lucero kay humanalig kaon. Sige, Miss Lucero. Unsa may nabantayan nimo dira? Okay? when you create a function, unsa may mga kailangan nimong ibutang para matawag na nimo siyang function or method baron. Asa naman to? Nawagtang si Lucero balik. Gibiya si Lucero. Hala, kalain, mamiya og klase. Giwalk outan ko. Tura day. Day. Sige, Lucero, yon ng camera. Okay? Para
Na-
maka...
Wala na akong counter.
kana, naon na. Sige. So, unsa na siya?
Ang code sir kay kuan. Walay ka ng static void ni.
Unsa to? Walay?
Walay static void. Sir.
Static void. Okay? Walay static void. Okay, so sige, let us refresh your memory sa previous topic. Okay? Method implementation. Is it required na static void?
Pub ay kanang although pwede sa mga public static void ni.
Public static. Pwede pa public static. Public static void. Di ba? Pero dire, wajud mo kabantay, guys. Hapit na jud. Ang imong answer, duol na jud sa ato ang gipangita. Sige. Ay, finally. Okay? Kana, walay return type.
Meron man
Okay.
din sa babaw with no return type.
Lagi, wajud mo magbasa. Okay, so mao na ang kalahian guys sa constructor over the methods. Okay? So matawag na nato siyang constructor because it has no return type and it is implemented using the same name as with the class. Okay? Sus matuo na juday ko ani unsa to ingon nila. More than 3% down sa mga bata diri sa Pilipinas. Walay reading comprehension. Di man sa way reading comprehension, walang mubasa.
Gutom
Okay.
rami, sir.
Lagi, parihara ta. Sige lang, napatay 8 minutes. So anyway, mo na siya ang constructor. Okay? How it differs from a regular method. Wala siya return type and it makes use of the class name as the name for that so-called constructor. Okay? So, a constructor is automatically invoked when that object is created. Okay? So, how do you create the object? Okay, you call the constructor. Okay? So, again, when you say invoke, that's just synonymous with the keyword call. Okay. So, when you call a constructor using this type of constructor nga naay parameter, rest assured that when you create an object, the fields inside it will be initialized with the value that you pass to your constructor. Okay? So, that actually helps lessen the code. Okay? Okay, if let's say, for example, ingon na kag lisudan, rational, sinsyain na lang, imagine na lang na, rational, then you rational, okay, without passing any parameter. So this will actually call the default constructor, by which when you create your object, okay, your fields, those that were not initialized, will be given a default value. So that means the numerator will have a value of 0 and the denominator will have a value of pila to? Oh, in this case, since wala, it will also have a value of 0. I-initialize siya base sa type that it holds. Okay? So, how about multiple constructors? Is it possible? Yes, it is still possible to have multiple constructors. Okay? So, pwede ang numerator lang ang imong specify. Since kabaw naman ka, ang denominator should always be a value of 1. Okay? That you could later on modify. Okay? So, is it, can supply constructor takes no argument? Yes. And that is what we call as the default constructor. Okay? So, when you can actually specify sa imong default constructor para pwede nimo i-initialize dito. Okay? Inside the constructor kung pilay value jud ni denominator if you don't want to modify the fields sa ibabaw. Pwede na nimo dito i-define sa constructor nimo. So, take note, when you say constructor, basically, mauna siya'y imuhang tawagon to set whatever initial values that you may want when your object is created. Okay? So, how does the compiler select which constructor ang ihang tawagon? Magdepende sa parameters nga imong i-pass. Okay? So, automatic na siya mahibaw ni compiler. Okay? So, mga kon lang ni siya, mga add info lang about the use of constructor. Okay? Now, let's look at this example. Okay? So, as stated, one constructor can invoke another constructor. Okay? So, in this example, when you use this syntax before the constructor body, okay, you are able to utilize other type of constructors. Let's say, for instance, kaning first constructor dire that requires 2 parameters. When you implement the next constructor, before the constructor body, which is defined by this open close statement block, you put that constructor initializer, okay, by using the keyword this and that symbol colon, okay, pwede nimo matawag ang kani nga constructor even before calling out this constructor. So essentially, there are cases man good that there are constructors that requires a lot of details inside. So instead of recreating all those details, why not just reuse that part of the code niya kung nalang kay usa ka parameter nga usbon, mao nay gamito nimo for the new constructor that you will be creating. So basically, you'll just reusing the previous constructor then modify just one parameter lang. In this case, kaning si numerator. Okay? Para dili ka magsigi og suwat sa tibuok code diri nga imo rang gikat and paste gikan sa previous nga constructor. Again, this is one of those ways, okay, which is utilized by C# to minimize the amount of coding, okay, sa program. Reusability sa code. Okay? So again, take note, the compiler generates a default constructor if no constructor is supplied by the programmer. That is why it is possible sa ato ang previous example, we were able to create an object even without the constructor. Kabantay mo ato? Di ba? Wala tayo constructor. We only had the fields and the methods. Okay? So, take note lang, in the initialization order, initialization option is executed in well-defined order. So, make sure the fields is set to its default values. Variable initializer runs in textual order from top to bottom, and your constructor will then be executed. Okay, so take note, the initializer variables inside your constructor is executed from order of top to bottom. So di ma-apply katong buhat nato before with fields and methods nga pwede ra mukam before ang paggamit nimo sa fields inside the method before that line where it was declared. Okay, kabantay mo ato ganina nga giuna nato tawag or gi-declare nato sa class ang method, then after the method sa ubos ato ang tukag ipang-declared ang fields, okay, or properties. Okay, so again, three common options for field initialization: the default values, the variable initializer, and the use of constructors. Okay, so basically make sure they are executed in well-defined order. Okay, so you should know the prerequisite before the first one is executed before the second one. Okay, so nakuwangan jud tag time. So supposed to be i-appeal pa unta na to discuss si static, but pwede ra ba siguro ninyo static field. Okay ra ninyo guys, sige na lang. Total, mag-meet pa man tayo ka Monday. Let's continue the discussion on Monday. Okay. So before we start our class on Monday, we'll just have a short check-up quiz about the topics of class and initialization. Okay. So ako lang ni aning i-post ang ato ang notes after this. Okay, so before we go, can we again make sure that all cameras are turned on? Naapay uban nga dili makita. Okay. Si Omega nag-dual cam. Si Valyesado. Okay, so at my count, 1, 2, 3, cheers. Dapa man Soul of Shades. Where's the sun? Okay, so guys, ana lang sa ta for now. It's a long holiday, 4 days. So, magbutang kog exercise para naamoy kalingawan ba kay para di ninyo malimtan ato ang topic. Okay? Mag-post ko diri sa classroom. Okay? Kay para ma-exercise ang ako ang gi-discuss, kay kung di ko maghatag og exercise kalimtan ra jud ninyo. Okay, lagi ato ang i-post. There are 2 slides for in our discussion. Ako ara na i-upload sa classroom. Okay, so I'll also provide an exercise for you to answer. Okay, pang warm up lang. Okay, para di malimtan. Kay again, if you don't practice how to code with this subject, okay, there's no way of knowing what you don't know. Okay, so sagnang exercise raman niya. Okay, gamay raman na siya grade. So I think with that said, that will be all for now. Okay, so kabaw ko wanay mangutana kay gipanggutom na, klaro kay sa dagway. So goodbye everyone and God bless. Okay, have a nice weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you, sir. Bye, sir.
Bye, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.